drowning in overdue bills, stained laundry, and chronic exhaustion. You are a single dad working for a notoriously ruthless billionaire. This is the kind of boss who fires executives for breathing too loudly in the elevator. Convinced your career is over after walking out mid-crisis on a Tuesday to care for your sick child, you drag yourself back to your miserable, cluttered apartment. Yet, upon opening the door, you're hit with the sharp scent of lemon bleach. There, standing in your kitchen wearing yellow rubber gloves and scrubbing yesterday's oatmeal from a cheap plastic bowl, is your terrifying CEO. Liam's alarm clock didn't ring. It buzzed. A low, mechanical death rattle that vibrated against the chipped particle board of his nightstand. It was 5:15 a.m. Outside his frosted bedroom window, the city was a bruised, pre-dawn purple. Liam stared at the ceiling, tracing the familiar water stain that looked vaguely like a skull. He didn't want to move. His spine felt like it had been replaced with crushed glass, the residual effect of falling asleep in an armchair while reading The Very Hungry Caterpillar for the 400th time. But he had to move. If he didn't move, the fragile, terrifying Jenga tower of his life would collapse. He threw off the thin duvet. The floorboards were freezing. He walked down the narrow hallway of his duplex, dodging a rogue plastic dinosaur with the practiced agility of a bomb disposal expert. He opened the door to the second bedroom. Chloe was sprawled across her toddler bed, one leg draped over the safety rail, snoring softly. She was 6 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, and possessed an energy level that bordered on the radioactive. Liam stood in the doorway for a long 30 seconds. It was the only peace he got in a 24-hour cycle. He watched her chest rise and fall. He felt the familiar heavy ache in his ribs, a potent cocktail of overwhelming love and suffocating terror. He was doing this alone. It had been 3 years since Sarah died. 3 years since a drunk driver ran a red light and turned Liam's perfectly ordinary life into a grueling survival test. "Time to wake up, Bug," he whispered, stepping into the room. The next 2 hours were a blur of minor catastrophes. The milk was sour. He had to improvise breakfast with dry Cheerios and a bruised apple. Chloe couldn't find her left shoe. When they finally found it, wedged behind the toilet, she decided she hated the socks she was wearing. By the time Liam dropped her off at the dingy neighborhood before-school program, he was already sweating through his dress shirt. He caught the 7:42 train by a margin of 3 seconds. He stood shoulder to shoulder with a dozen other miserable commuters, gripping the overhead bar, staring blankly at the dark tunnel walls whizzing by. At 8:30 a.m., Liam walked through the revolving glass doors of Hayes Global. The building was a monument to clinical, ruthless efficiency, 50 stories of steel and glass, dominating the skyline. Inside, the lobby was all white marble and brushed aluminum. It felt less like a corporate headquarters and more like a high-end morgue. Liam swiped his badge. A mechanical chime registered his existence. He was a senior logistics analyst. It was a fancy title for a guy who stared at spreadsheets all day, figuring out how to shave fractions of a cent off international shipping routes. He was a small, replaceable cog in a multi-billion-dollar machine. And the woman who owned the machine was terrifying. Jacqueline Hayes didn't just run the company. She haunted it. She had inherited a modest regional shipping firm in her late 20s and, over the next 15 years, ruthlessly transformed it into a global logistics empire. She was 42, possessed eyes the color of winter ice, and wore tailored suits that probably cost more than Liam's car. She was notoriously demanding. The corporate lore surrounding her was legendary. She had once fired a vice president mid-presentation because his data was 3 hours out of date. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She simply stared at you until your soul withered, delivered a quiet, devastating assessment of your incompetence, and had security escort you to the curb. Liam kept his head down. He lived by a simple rule at Hayes Global: remain invisible. If Jacqueline Hayes didn't know his name, she couldn't fire him. He sat in his cubicle on the 22nd floor, drank terrible break-room coffee, and did his job flawlessly. He couldn't afford a single mistake. The health insurance alone was the only reason Chloe could get her asthma inhalers. He booted up his computer. The screen glared back at him. 700 unread emails. A massive integration project for a new European warehouse was going live at the end of the week. The data was a mess. Liam rubbed his eyes, took a sip of his lukewarm coffee, and started typing. He just needed to survive until 5 p.m. Just one more day. By 2:14 p.m., the air on the 22nd floor was thick with panic. The European integration wasn't just messy, it was fundamentally broken. The server APIs were rejecting the shipping manifests. Millions of dollars of freight were effectively stranded in digital purgatory. The floor manager, a perpetually sweating man named Peterson, was pacing the aisles, barking orders. "I need that data compiled. We need the bypass codes, now!" Liam was buried in code, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He was the only one who actually understood the legacy architecture they were trying to overwrite. If he could isolate the rogue variables, he could manually bridge the servers. He had been staring at the monitor so long his vision was blurring. Then, the elevator pinged. The floor went dead silent. The furious clacking of keyboards stopped. The frantic pacing ceased. Jacqueline Hayes stepped onto the floor. She was flanked by two nervous-looking executives. She wore a charcoal wool suit, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, immaculate twist. She didn't walk. She glided. The silence in her wake was absolute. "Mr. Peterson." Her voice cut through the room. It wasn't loud, but it carried effortlessly. It was smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of inflection. Peterson practically tripped over his own feet, rushing to meet her. "Ms. Hayes, we are addressing the integration block. It's a server handshake issue." "I don't need a technical autopsy, Peterson," Jacqueline said, stopping near Liam's row of cubicles. "I need to know when the freight in Rotterdam's going to move. We are losing $40,000 an hour." "My best analyst is on it," Peterson stammered, gesturing wildly toward Liam's desk. "Harding, he's isolating the code now." Jacqueline's ice-blue gaze shifted. For the first time in 4 years, the CEO looked directly at Liam. Liam froze. His hands hovered over the keyboard. Her eyes were sharp, analytical, taking him in. He suddenly felt incredibly aware of the coffee stain on his cuff and the cheap fabric of his tie. "How long, Mr. Harding?" she asked. Before Liam could open his mouth to reply, his cell phone rang. It wasn't a subtle vibrate. It was a loud, obnoxious marimba ringtone. It shattered the tense silence of the floor like a dropped plate. Liam's blood ran cold. He had set a custom ringtone for exactly one number. The elementary school nurse. He stared at the phone sitting on his desk. It kept ringing. Peterson looked like he was about to have a stroke. "Harding, turn that off," he hissed. Jacqueline Hayes just watched him, her expression unreadable. "Are you going to answer that, or are you going to fix my network?" she asked quietly. Liam's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew the rules. You don't take personal calls during a crisis. You certainly don't take them when the billionaire owner of the company is standing 3 feet away. But the school only called if it was an emergency. Chloe's asthma. A fever. An injury. He looked at the spreadsheet on his monitor. Millions of dollars. He looked at the flashing name on his phone. Nurse Davis. The choice took less than half a second. Liam reached out and picked up the phone. He didn't break eye contact with Jacqueline as he pressed it to his ear. "Hello? Mr. Harding." The nurse's voice crackled through the receiver. "It's Chloe. Her fever spiked to 103, and she's having trouble keeping her breath steady. You need to come get her immediately. I'm on my way, Liam said. His voice was remarkably steady, completely disconnected from the sheer panic flooding his veins. He hung up. He looked back at the screen, saved his progress, and locked the terminal. He stood up and grabbed his battered messenger bag. Peterson stepped forward, blocking his path. Harding, what the hell are you doing? We are in the middle of a Tier 1 outage. Sit down. My daughter is sick. She's at the school. I have to go, Liam said. You can't leave, Peterson yelled, his face turning magenta. If you walk out now, don't bother coming back. Liam felt a strange, hollow calm wash over him. It was the feeling of a man stepping off a ledge. He was done. The job, the insurance, the fragile stability, it was all gone. But he didn't care. Nothing mattered more than the tiny, wheezing girl waiting for him across town. He bypassed Peterson, stepping around the larger man. He stopped just short of Jacqueline Hayes. She hadn't moved. She was watching him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. The isolated data is in the temp folder on my desktop, Liam said directly to her, his voice flat. Anyone with a basic understanding of Python can finish bridging the servers. It'll take about 20 minutes. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Miss Hayes. He didn't wait for her to respond. He didn't wait for security to escort him out. He simply walked to the elevator, pressed the down button, and stepped inside. As the doors slid shut, he saw Jacqueline still standing there, staring at the empty space where he had just been. The ride down to the lobby felt like an eternity. Liam leaned his head against the cool metal of the elevator wall and closed his eyes. He had just thrown his life away. He was 34, unemployed, and entirely alone. But as the doors opened on the ground floor, he shoved the despair down into a tight, dark box in his chest. He couldn't afford to break down yet. He had to get to Chloe. The rain started while Liam was on the bus. It wasn't a gentle shower. It was a miserable, freezing downpour that turned the city streets into slick, gray rivers. When he reached the school clinic, Chloe looked awful. Her cheeks were flushed red, her hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, and her breathing was shallow and raspy. Liam wrapped her in his oversized coat, signed the release forms with a shaking hand, and carried her out to the street. They took a cab home. It cost $30 he absolutely didn't have, but he wasn't going to drag a sick child through the rain on public transit. Chloe fell asleep against his chest, her small hands clutching his ruined shirt. I got you, Bug, he murmured into her hair. Daddy's got you. It was a lie. He didn't have anything. He was going to have to file for unemployment tomorrow. He'd have to beg his landlord for an extension on the rent. He'd have to figure out how to afford her asthma medication without the corporate pharmacy plan. The math spiraled in his head, a terrifying equation with no solution. The cab dropped them off in front of his duplex. The neighborhood looked even more depressing in the rain. Stray garbage clung to the chain-link fences. The paint on his front porch was peeling in large, sad flakes. Liam shifted Chloe's weight to his left arm and fished his keys out of his pocket. He just wanted to get her into bed, give her some Tylenol, and then maybe sit in the dark and have a quiet panic attack. He unlocked the deadbolt. He turned the handle and pushed the door open. He stepped over the threshold, expecting the usual chaos. He expected to trip over the pile of junk mail he hadn't sorted. He expected to see the mountain of clean but unfolded laundry dominating the cheap sofa. He expected the faint, lingering smell of old cooking oil and damp coats. Instead, he stopped dead in his tracks. The hallway was clear. The junk mail was gone. He took a slow step forward, his boots squelching slightly on the entryway mat. He looked into the small living room. The sofa was clear. The throw pillows were actually arranged. The scattered toys, the blocks, the stray crayons, the headless Barbie dolls were gone, packed away into the plastic bins against the wall. The coffee table had been wiped down. The floor had been vacuumed. Liam's breath hitched. A primal protective instinct flared in his chest. Someone was in his house. He tightened his grip on Chloe, pulling her closer. He reached out and grabbed the heavy, rusted umbrella stand near the door, hefting it like a club. He didn't call out. He moved silently, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He smelled something. Sharp, chemical, bleach, and lemon. The scent was coming from the kitchen. He heard the faint squeak of rubber against porcelain. Liam crept down the short hallway, the umbrella stand raised. He rounded the corner into the kitchen, his muscles tensed for a fight. "Who the hell?" he started, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The words died in his throat. The umbrella stand slipped from his grip, clattering against the linoleum floor. Standing at his sink, wearing a pair of bright yellow Playtex rubber gloves, was Jacqueline Hayes. She paused mid-scrub. She was holding the crusty plastic bowl Liam had abandoned that morning. The sleeves of her pristine, custom-tailored white blouse were rolled up to her elbows. Her $4,000 charcoal blazer was draped carelessly over the back of one of Liam's mismatched dining chairs. The kitchen counters, usually a disaster zone of mail and dirty dishes, were gleaming. The stove had been scoured. Liam simply stared, his brain completely short-circuited. He blinked, expecting the hallucination to fade, a symptom of stress and lack of sleep. But she didn't fade. The billionaire CEO of Hayes Global turned off the faucet. She carefully placed the clean bowl on the drying rack. She pulled off the right rubber glove with a wet snap and turned to face him. Her ice-blue eyes swept over Liam, taking in his soaked clothes, his pale face, and the sleeping child bundled in his arms. "You left your screen unlocked, Mr. Harding," Jacqueline said. Her voice was just as calm, just as cool as it had been on the 22nd floor. "Your home address was in the employee directory." Liam opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. What are you doing in my house?" He finally managed to croak, the absurdity of the situation strangling his vocal cords. Jacqueline didn't answer immediately. She reached over, grabbed a roll of cheap paper towels, and methodically dried her hands. "Your daughter," she said softly, nodding toward Chloe. "Is she all right?" "She has a fever," Liam stammered, entirely thrown off balance. "She needs rest. Ms. Hayes, seriously, what is happening? Am I being fired in person? Because doing my dishes first is a really weird severance package." The corners of Jacqueline's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, not exactly, but the glacial mask cracked just a fraction. "You aren't fired, Liam," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. It sounded strange coming from her. "Put your daughter to bed. We need to talk." She turned back to the sink, picked up a sponge, and began wiping down the faucet. "And take off your wet shoes. I just mopped that floor." Liam stood frozen for another 5 seconds, entirely convinced he had finally lost his mind. But Chloe whimpered against his neck, shivering. Reality reasserted itself. He turned away from his CEO, walked into Chloe's bedroom, which, he noticed numbly, had also been tidied, the bed freshly made, and gently laid his daughter down. When he emerged, Jacqueline was sitting at his small dining table. She had made tea. She pushed a mug across the cheap wood towards the empty chair opposite her. "Sit," she instructed. Liam sat. He stared at the steam rising from the mug. He looked across the table at the most powerful, ruthless woman he had ever met, sitting in his poverty-line kitchen, smelling of cheap lemon cleaner. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "People like you don't do things like this." Jacqueline folded her hands on the table. She looked at him for a long time, the cold executive armor peeling back, revealing something worn, heavy, and unexpectedly human underneath. 14 years ago, she said quietly, her eyes focusing on a spot on the wall behind him. I walked out of a boardroom meeting. I was closing the deal that would make my company a global entity. It was the most important day of my life. She stopped. The silence in the small kitchen was deafening, broken only by the steady drum of rain against the window. My assistant tried to stop me, Jacqueline continued, her voice tightening. He told me my husband had called, that my son, David, had a sudden fever, a high one. Liam stopped breathing. Jacqueline's eyes drifted back to Liam's. They were no longer ice. They were glass, shattered and fragile. I told my assistant to tell my husband to give him Tylenol and to hold my calls, she whispered. I chose the freight. I chose the deal. A single tear broke free, tracking slowly down the billionaire's flawless cheek. It wasn't a fever, she said, her voice finally breaking. It was bacterial meningitis. By the time I turned my phone back on 6 hours later, he was already gone. The silence in the kitchen stretched, pulled taut, and held. Liam didn't move. He forgot to breathe. The rain battered the cheap aluminum siding of his duplex, a relentless, drumming soundtrack to a confession he was never supposed to hear. He stared at the billionaire sitting across from him. Jacqueline Hayes, the woman who fired executives for blinking too slowly, was crying in his kitchen. It wasn't a messy, hysterical breakdown. It was a single, silent tear that carried the gravitational pull of a collapsed star. Liam looked down at his hands. His knuckles were white. He felt a sudden, profound nausea, a visceral reaction to the sheer, crushing weight of her regret. You don't hand a tissue to a deity. You don't offer platitudes to a force of nature. I'm sorry, Liam said. The words tasted like ash. They were entirely, utterly inadequate, but they were the only words he had. Jacqueline didn't reply immediately. She closed her eyes. She took a slow, deliberate breath, holding it for 3 seconds before exhaling through her nose. It was a practiced mechanism, a physical reset button. When she opened her eyes, the shattered glass had been swept away, replaced by the familiar, impenetrable ice. But the edges were softer now. She reached up and wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, a remarkably unpolished gesture. Meningitis, Jacqueline said, her voice hollow. It moves incredibly fast, a fever, a stiff neck, lethargy. By the time my husband forced his way into the emergency room, David was unresponsive. I was sitting in a leather chair on the 42nd floor, drinking sparkling water, negotiating a 2% margin increase on transatlantic freight. She looked at her manicured fingernails. I won the negotiation, she added. The bitterness in her tone was absolute. I gained $12 million in projected revenue for the fiscal year, and I lost my son. Liam finally reached for his mug. The tea was lukewarm, bitter from steeping too long. He took a sip anyway. He needed something to anchor him to reality. Why are you telling me this? Liam asked. He kept his voice low, afraid to break the fragile atmosphere in the room. I'm a data analyst. I compile spreadsheets. We haven't spoken 2 words to each other in the 4 years I've worked for you. Because you walked away, Jacqueline said. She met his gaze directly. When Peterson yelled at you, when you were staring at a catastrophic system failure that you knew how to fix, I was standing right there, effectively holding a gun to your career. Jacqueline leaned forward slightly. And you didn't hesitate. You didn't try to bargain. You didn't apologize to me. You chose the girl with the fever. Liam swallowed hard. The memory of the choice was already fading, replaced by the sheer adrenaline of the aftermath. I didn't have a choice, he said simply. It's just me and Chloe. There is no backup. There is no plan B. If she falls, I have to catch her. That's the whole job. You had a choice, Liam, Jacqueline corrected quietly. People make the wrong choice every day. They justify it. They tell themselves it's just this once, that the money is for the family, that the promotion will buy a better life. I told myself I was building an empire for David. She looked around the tiny kitchen. She looked at the scuffed linoleum, the ancient refrigerator, the cracked tile behind the sink. I drove here today, she said, because I wanted to see the man who did what I couldn't do. I wanted to see what kind of life produces that kind of absolute clarity. Liam felt a strange, defensive spike in his chest. It produces this, he said, gesturing to the cramped room. It produces overdue bills and generic brand cereal. It produces exhaustion. Clarity doesn't pay the rent, Ms. Hayes. No, she agreed. It doesn't. From down the hall, a sharp, ragged cough echoed out. It was followed by a whimpering cry. Liam was out of his chair before his brain consciously processed the sound. He left his tea. He left his billionaire boss. He rushed down the hallway and pushed open Chloe's door. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of a cheap plastic nightlight. Chloe was thrashing under the thin blankets. Her skin was radiating heat. "Daddy," she cried, her voice thin and reedy. "My chest hurts." "I'm here, Bug," Liam said, dropping to his knees beside the bed. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. She was burning up. The Tylenol hadn't kicked in yet, or it wasn't strong enough. He reached for her rescue inhaler on the nightstand. "Sit up for me. Let's get some air in there." He helped her sit, shaking the small plastic canister. He placed the spacer over her mouth and nose. "Deep breath. 1, 2, 3. He pressed the canister. A hiss of medication filled the plastic tube. Chloe inhaled weakly, coughing violently on the exhale. "Again," Liam urged, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Try to hold it this time." He did it again. This time she managed to hold her breath for a few seconds before exhaling. Her breathing was still shallow, still raspy, but the sharp, terrifying wheeze had dulled slightly. Liam sank back on his heels, dragging a hand down his exhausted face. He needed cold washcloths. He needed to check her temperature again. He needed to stay awake. A shadow fell across the doorway. Jacqueline Hayes stood there. She had taken off her suit jacket. Her pristine white sleeves were rolled up. She wasn't looking at Liam. She was looking entirely at Chloe. "The fever is spiking," Jacqueline said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Liam breathed out. "I need to get some cold water." "I'll get it," Jacqueline said. Before Liam could protest, she turned and disappeared down the hall. 30 seconds later, she returned. She was holding a plastic basin filled with cool water and 3 clean washcloths she must have found in the hall closet. She didn't ask for permission. She walked into the small bedroom, knelt on the worn carpet opposite Liam, and wrung out a washcloth. "Hi, Chloe," Jacqueline said softly. Her voice lacked the cold, metallic edge it held in the boardroom. It was warm. It was distinctly maternal. "We're going to cool you down a bit, okay?" Chloe blinked, her fever-bright eyes struggling to focus on the strange woman in her bedroom. "Who are you?" "I work with your dad," Jacqueline said, gently placing the damp cloth across Chloe's forehead. "My name is Jacqueline." Liam watched, completely paralyzed, as the CEO of Hayes Global expertly smoothed the wet cloth over his daughter's brow, her thumb gently brushing away a damp strand of hair. The billionaire wasn't playing a part. The mechanical, ruthless executive was gone. In her place was a ghost, a mother who was 12 years too late to cool her own child's fever, desperately, quietly pouring that stranded love into the sick girl in front of her. By 11 p.m., the storm outside had settled into a steady, rhythmic drizzle. The duplex was quiet. The kind of heavy, expectant silence that only exists in a house with a sick child. Liam was sitting on the floor in Chloe's room, his back against the peeling wallpaper. His legs were numb. He had been staring at the wall for 40 minutes, completely tapped out. Across the small bed, sitting in a cheap, faux leather beanbag chair, was Jacqueline. She looked entirely incongruous. Her tailored trousers were wrinkled. She had kicked off her designer heels an hour ago, revealing plain, sensible black socks. She was holding a digital thermometer in one hand and a damp washcloth in the other. Chloe was finally asleep. Her breathing was even. The wheeze was gone, and the flush in her cheeks had subsided to a dull pink. The fever had broken 20 minutes ago. "She's resting comfortably," Jacqueline whispered, checking the digital readout. 99.2. We're out of the woods. Liam let his head drop back against the wall with a soft thud. He let out a long, ragged breath, feeling the adrenaline finally drain from his bloodstream. It left behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. "Thank you," he said. His voice was raw. "You didn't have to stay. You didn't have to do any of this." Jacqueline placed the thermometer on the nightstand. She looked at Liam, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. "I wanted to," she said simply. "I haven't sat in a child's room in a very long time." Liam looked at her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the tension held in the line of her jaw. The cynical part of his brain, the part that survived corporate layoffs and navigated a hostile world, whispered that this was a trick, that a billionaire doesn't scrub floors and tend to sick kids without an angle. But looking at her now, stripped of her armor, sitting in a beanbag chair, the cynic shut up. "Her mother," Jacqueline started, her voice hesitant. "Sarah. Was that her name?" Liam flinched. He wasn't used to people saying her name. Most people avoided it, treating his dead wife like a radioactive subject. "Yes," Liam said softly. "Sarah. How did she die?" It was a blunt question, a brutal one. But coming from Jacqueline, a woman who had just laid her own bleeding trauma on his kitchen table, it felt fair. It felt like an exchange of currency between two survivors. "A Tuesday," Liam said, looking at the plastic dinosaur on the floor. "She was driving home from the grocery store. It was 2 p.m., broad daylight. A guy in a heavily modified pickup truck decided he didn't want to wait for the red light. He was twice the legal limit." Liam swallowed. The memory was a physical weight in his throat. "He'd boned her sedan on the driver's side at 60 miles an hour, Liam continued, his voice devoid of emotion. It was the only way he could tell the story. "She died on impact. I was at work. I was sitting in a cubicle complaining about a broken printer while my wife bled out on the asphalt." Jacqueline didn't say anything. She didn't offer empty sympathies. She just watched him, holding the space for his grief. "Chloe was 3, Liam whispered. "She doesn't really remember her. She knows the pictures. She knows the stories I tell her. But she doesn't remember the smell of her hair or the way she laughed." He looked up at the water-stained ceiling. "It's terrifying," he admitted, the truth finally spilling out of him. "Every single day is terrifying. I'm one paycheck away from missing rent. I'm one bad asthma attack away from a hospital bill that will bankrupt me. I am constantly, perpetually failing." "You aren't failing," Jacqueline said sharply. Liam looked at her, startled by the sudden steel in her voice. "Look at this room, Liam," she said, gesturing to the space around them. "Look at her." She pointed to the sleeping girl. "She is clean. She is safe. She is loved with a ferocity that is frankly staggering," Jacqueline said, her eyes blazing with an intense, fierce certainty. "You gave up your career today to make sure she could breathe. You are surviving in a system built to crush you. Do not insult yourself by calling that failure." Liam stared at her. For 3 years, he had carried the crushing guilt of not being enough. Not enough money, not enough time, not enough energy. To hear this woman, a woman who defined modern success, tell him otherwise. It broke something loose inside his chest. A single, hot tear escaped his eye, tracking down his nose. He wiped it away angrily. "I don't know what to do tomorrow," he confessed quietly. "I walked out on a Tier 1 outage. Peterson is going to fire me before I even swipe my badge." Jacqueline sat back in the beanbag chair. She looked thoughtfully at the cheap carpet. The corporate strategist, dormant for the last 4 hours, slowly began to boot back up. "Peterson," she mused, the name dripping with sudden disdain. "Peterson is a middle management sycophant who panics at the first sign of friction. He couldn't isolate a rogue variable if it was highlighted in neon. How long would it have taken you to fix the European integration?" Liam blinked, thrown by the sudden pivot back to work. "I told you, 20 minutes. The legacy code was conflicting with the new API handshakes. I just needed to write a bypass script for the null values. And instead of asking you for the script, he yelled at you for answering a phone call from a school nurse," she said, her voice dropping a few degrees in temperature. "It's company policy," Liam defended weakly. "No personal calls on the floor during an outage." "Company policy," Jacqueline repeated. She stood up. She smoothed the wrinkles out of her trousers. The maternal ghost was receding. The CEO was stepping back into the light. But she looked different now. The ice wasn't meant for Liam anymore. "I own the company," Jacqueline said, her tone absolute. "I write the policies. And I do not pay incompetent managers to terrorize brilliant analysts who actually understand my network architecture." She looked down at him. "Don't worry about Peterson tomorrow," she said quietly. "Get some sleep, Liam." She turned and walked out of the bedroom. Liam heard her footsteps in the hall, heard the front door open, and heard the quiet click of the deadbolt sliding into place as she pulled it shut behind her. He sat alone in the dark, listening to the rain, wondering if the entire evening had been a fever dream of his own making. The sun rose ugly and gray. It wasn't a cinematic sunrise. It was just a slow, grudging lightening of the sky that revealed the puddles on the street and the damp trash on the sidewalk. Liam woke up with a crick in his neck. He was still on the floor of Chloe's room. He scrambled up, his heart immediately jumping into his throat. He looked at the bed. Chloe was sitting up. She had a picture book open on her lap. She looked pale, and her hair was a tangled mess, but her eyes were clear. "Daddy," she said, looking up, "I'm hungry." Liam let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 12 hours. He stepped forward and felt her forehead. Cool. Dry. "Hey, bug," he smiled, his face cracking with the effort. "Hungry is good. Hungry we can do. How about some toast?" "With the cinnamon sugar?" she asked hopefully. "With extra cinnamon sugar," he promised. He left her reading and walked out into the hallway. The house was quiet. He half expected to find Jacqueline sleeping on his couch, but the living room was empty. The kitchen was just as she had left it, immaculately clean. His mug of cold tea was still sitting on the table. He made the toast. He made a fresh pot of coffee, drinking 2 cups in rapid succession to kickstart his exhausted brain. It was Wednesday morning. 7:30 a.m. He was supposed to be on the train in 12 minutes. He sat at the kitchen table, watching Chloe nibble on her toast. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. Jacqueline Hayes had said not to worry about Peterson. She had offered a momentary, bizarre comfort. But she was a billionaire, and he was a guy who couldn't afford to fix his car's transmission. Billionaires forget things. They get back in their town cars, they return to their penthouses, and the problems of the people below them fade into the background noise of the city. He needed to go in. He needed to formally resign, try to negotiate a severance package, or beg for his job back. He called Mrs. Higgins, his elderly neighbor who occasionally watched Chloe in emergencies. He offered her $50 he didn't have to sit with Chloe for 3 hours. She agreed. By 8:45 a.m., Liam was standing in the lobby of Hayes Global. He swiped his badge at the turnstile. Beep. A green light flashed. He frowned. If he had been terminated yesterday, his badge should have been deactivated. He rode the elevator up to the 22nd floor. The anxiety in his chest was a living, clawing thing. He stepped out onto the floor. It was quiet. The frantic energy of the previous day was gone. People were sitting at their desks, drinking coffee, typing quietly. Liam walked toward his cubicle. He passed Peterson's glass-walled office. It was empty, not just empty of Peterson, empty of everything. The desk was clear. The pictures of Peterson's boat were gone from the walls. The nameplate had been removed from the door. Liam stopped dead. He stared at the empty office. "Hey, Harding." Liam turned. It was Sarah, a junior analyst from 3 rows over. "Hey," Liam said cautiously. "Where's Peterson?" Sarah lowered her voice, looking around conspiratorially. "Fired, last night. Brutal, too. HR was here at 8 p.m. packing up his desk." Liam felt the blood drain from his face. "And the integration?" Liam asked numbly. "Fixed," she said. "Some bypass script got uploaded around midnight. The servers are talking. The freight is moving." Liam walked to his desk. He sat down in his cheap mesh chair. He moved his mouse to wake up his monitors. There was a single email in his inbox. It wasn't from HR. It wasn't a company-wide memo. The sender was jhayesglobal.com. Liam's hand hovered over the mouse. He clicked it open. "Mr. Harding, the European integration is stable. The script you drafted was, as you promised, highly effective. Effective immediately. The position of floor manager for the 22nd floor is vacant. The compensation package includes an 80% salary increase, full executive medical coverage, and flexible remote hours to accommodate family emergencies. You will move into the corner office by noon today. Do not make me regret my clarity. J. Hayes." Liam stared at the screen. He read the email 3 times. The words didn't change. An 80% increase. Executive medical. He could afford the good inhalers. He could fix the car. He wouldn't have to panic every time the school nurse called. He looked at the empty glass office across the floor. He looked back at the screen. He didn't cheer. He didn't jump up and down. He leaned back in his chair, covered his face with his hands, and let out a long, shaky breath. It wasn't a fairy tale. Jacqueline Hayes wasn't a fairy godmother. She was a ruthless, calculating CEO who had recognized a flaw in her machine, Peterson, and replaced him with a more efficient part. She had solved a business problem. But she had also seen him. She had sat on a cheap beanbag chair and wiped his daughter's fevered brow. She had looked at the broken, terrifying architecture of his life and decided, quietly, to hand him a hammer and nails. Liam dropped his hands. He looked at the keyboard. He hit reply. "Ms. Hayes, I'll have my things moved by 11:30. Thank you." He paused, his fingers hovering over the keys. He thought about the smell of lemon bleach in his kitchen. He thought about the single tear in a billionaire's eye. He added one more line. "If you ever need a decent cup of tea, you know where I live." He hit send. He closed the email client, opened his analytics software, and got to work. 6 months later, Liam was sitting in the corner office on the 22nd floor. It was a strange transition. For 4 years, he had been a ghost in a cubicle, terrified of making a sound. Now he had walls. He had a door that closed with a satisfying, heavy click. He had a window that looked out over the gray expanse of the city, watching the traffic crawl along the arteries of the metropolis. He hadn't magically become a different person. He still drank the terrible break-room coffee out of habit. He still wore shirts he bought off the clearance rack, though they were pressed now. The panic of poverty had receded, replaced by the crushing responsibility of keeping a multi-billion-dollar supply chain from cannibalizing itself. But the fear was gone. When you have survived the worst thing that can happen to you, when you have watched the person you love die, and then spent 3 years drowning in the aftermath, the threat of a corporate deadline loses its teeth. Liam managed the floor with a detached clinical efficiency that terrified his juniors and infuriated the executives above him. He didn't yell. He didn't panic. When a cargo plane was grounded in Frankfurt, he didn't throw a tantrum like Peterson used to. He walked to the whiteboard, mapped the reroute through Munich, authorized the overtime, and went back to his desk. He was home by 5:30 p.m. every single day. That was the line. Jacqueline Hayes had promised flexible hours, and Liam tested that boundary with absolute ruthlessness. At 5 p.m., he locked his terminal. If a server caught fire at 5:01 p.m., it burned until morning. Or, more accurately, it burned until Liam opened his laptop on his kitchen table after Chloe was asleep. The money changed everything. It didn't bring Sarah back. It didn't fix the hollow ache in his chest when he saw couples holding hands in the grocery store, but it bought him an arsenal. It bought a top-tier pediatric pulmonologist who put Chloe on a preventative steroid that actually worked. The terrifying midnight emergency room runs stopped. It bought a reliable, slightly bruised Honda Civic. It bought an apartment in a neighborhood where the streetlights actually worked, and the neighbors didn't scream at each other at 2 a.m. It bought him the ability to breathe. In late November, the Pacific supply chain fractured. A massive coordinated dockworkers' strike hit 3 major ports on the West Coast simultaneously. By noon on a Tuesday, 48 container ships were idling in the ocean, burning fuel and bleeding money. The 22nd floor was a war room. Phones were ringing off the hook. Analysts were shouting across the aisles. Liam stood in the center of the floor, arms crossed. He watched the digital map on the main display screen turn completely red. Millions of dollars of electronics, pharmaceuticals, and raw materials were essentially parked in the ocean. His phone buzzed. It was an internal call from the 50th floor. Jacqueline's office. He picked it up. Harding. Liam. Jacqueline's voice was crisp, cutting through the background noise of his own floor. I need a casualty report on the Pacific block. It's a complete bottleneck, Liam said, pulling up his own data. Long Beach, Oakland, and Seattle are shut down. The union isn't budging. We have perishable freight that will spoil in 72 hours. What's the bypass? She asked. No panic, just the expectation of a solution. There isn't a clean one, Liam replied bluntly. I can reroute the perishables through Vancouver and put them on rail, but it's going to cost us an extra $3 million in transit fees and tariffs. The non-essentials can sit in the water. We eat the fuel costs and wait the strike out. Silence on the line. $3 million was a massive hit to the quarterly margins. Do it, Jacqueline said. Vancouver rail is heavily congested, Liam warned. I need authorization to outbid our competitors for track priority. It's going to be dirty, and it's going to piss off the Canadian Pacific executives. I don't care about their feelings. I care about my freight, Jacqueline countered, her voice dropping to a dangerous register. Buy the track. Use my name if they push back. Get it moving. She hung up. Liam lowered the phone. He looked at Sarah, the junior analyst who had taken over his old desk. Get Vancouver on the line, he ordered. Tell them Hayes Global is buying the next 4 commercial rail slots. Whatever the asking price is, add 20%. Sarah blanched. 20%? Are you sure? Just make the call, Sarah, Liam said, walking back to his office. And tell them Jacqueline Hayes is watching the clock. It took 14 hours. Liam stayed at the office until 9:00 p.m., having called his neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, to watch Chloe. He hated breaking his own rule. But this wasn't a fire. It was a nuke. He orchestrated the reroute like the conductor directing a violent, metallic symphony. Trains were bought. Ships were diverted. By midnight, he was sitting at his kitchen table in the new apartment, staring at his laptop screen. The red dots on the west coast had thinned out. A steady line of green dots was moving south from Vancouver. He had stopped the bleeding. He closed the laptop. The apartment was quiet. He walked into Chloe's room. She was sprawled across her new, full-sized bed, surrounded by a small army of stuffed animals. Her breathing was deep and clear. Liam stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame. He felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, but the panic was gone. He had navigated the storm. He had protected his daughter. He had protected the empire of the woman who had scrubbed his floors. For the first time in 3 years, Liam realized he wasn't just surviving. He was actually living. The summons came 3 weeks later. It wasn't an email. It was a physical, cream-colored envelope handed to Liam by one of the executive couriers. Inside was a single piece of heavy cardstock. 50th floor. 2:00 p.m. The 50th floor of Hayes Global was a fortress. You needed a special access chip just to make the elevator go that high. Liam stepped out of the brass-lined car into a reception area that looked like a modern art museum. It was dead silent. The air smelled faintly of ozone and expensive cedar. A severe-looking man in a bespoke suit looked up from a minimalist desk. "Mr. Harding, she's expecting you." Liam walked down a wide, carpeted hallway and approached the double-glass doors at the end. They opened automatically. Jacqueline Hayes' office was massive. One entire wall was floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a dizzying, terrifying view of the city. The storm clouds were rolling in, painting the skyline in shades of bruised purple and gray. Jacqueline was standing by the window, looking out. She wore a tailored black dress, severe and uncompromising. "Ms. Hayes," Liam said, stopping a few feet inside the room. She turned. She looked tired. The flawless armor was intact, but Liam could see the micro-expressions, the slight tightening around her eyes, the rigid set of her shoulders. The dockworkers' strike had taken a toll on everyone. "Sit down, Liam," she said, gesturing to the seating area, 2 white leather couches facing a glass coffee table. Liam sat. Jacqueline walked over and sat opposite him. She didn't have a file. She didn't have a tablet. She just looked at him. "The final numbers from the Vancouver reroute came in this morning," Jacqueline began, her voice clinically detached. "We took a hit. 4.2 million in excess transit fees." Liam didn't flinch. He held her gaze. "And we saved 28 million in spoiled freight and contractual penalties. The system held." "It did," she agreed smoothly. "You outbid Maersk and FedEx for the rail lines. The CEO of Canadian Pacific called me personally to complain about my floor manager's aggressive tactics." "I was authorized to use your name," Liam reminded her. A ghost of a smirk played on Jacqueline's lips. "I didn't apologize to him. I told him if he didn't want to get bullied, he should build more tracks." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. The CEO persona receded, replaced by the quiet, intense woman who had sat in his kitchen 6 months ago. "I'm firing the Vice President of North American Logistics," Jacqueline stated flatly. "He panicked during the strike. He wanted to wait it out. If I had listened to him, we would be facing a shareholder revolt right now." Liam felt a sudden, cold prickle of anticipation. He knew where this was going. "I want you in the seat, Liam," she said. It wasn't a question. VP of Logistics. It comes with a corner suite on the 45th floor, stock options, and a salary that ensures your daughter will never have to worry about tuition, housing, or medical care for the rest of her life. It was the golden ticket. It was the lottery. It was everything he had been fighting for. Liam looked at the glass table. He thought about the numbers. He thought about the terrifying, euphoric relief of never having to look at a price tag again. Then, he thought about the cost. He looked up at Jacqueline. No. The silence that followed was absolute. Jacqueline didn't blink. She didn't frown. She simply processed the refusal like a machine hitting a corrupted line of code. "Explain," she demanded quietly. "I know what that job is," Liam said, his voice steady. "I watch the VPs. They live in this building. They are on call 24 hours a day. They fly to London on a Tuesday and Tokyo on a Thursday. They don't have lives. They have itineraries." He leaned back on the white leather. "I leave at 5 p.m., Liam said. The words felt incredibly heavy in the silent room. "I take Chloe to ballet on Wednesdays. I make her breakfast every morning. If she gets sick, I walk out. That's the deal. If I take a VP role, I lose her. And I am not losing her." Jacqueline stared at him. Her ice-blue eyes tracked his face, searching for hesitation, searching for a bargaining position. She found none. "You are turning down generational wealth," she said, her voice a low murmur. "So you can attend a Wednesday ballet class." "Yes," Liam said simply. Jacqueline stood up. She walked back to the window, turning her back to him. She looked out at the rolling gray clouds. For a long time, the only sound in the massive office was the faint hum of the climate control system. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow, stripped of its corporate edge. "When David was 4, she said to the glass, "he had a school play. He was a tree. He didn't even have lines, just stood there in a cardboard costume." She crossed her arms, holding herself tightly. "I had a board meeting," she continued. "I told myself I'd make the next one. I told myself the company needed me. I missed it. My husband recorded it on a camcorder. I watched it in a hotel room in Geneva, alone." She turned to face Liam. The mask was entirely gone. She was just a woman haunted by a ghost she could never outrun. "You're right," Jacqueline said, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't take the job. Don't become me." Liam stood up. He felt a sudden fierce wave of empathy for the billionaire. She had conquered the world, but she had burned her own house down to do it. "I'll stay on the 22nd floor," Liam said gently. "I'll keep your freight moving. You just keep letting me go home at 5. Jacqueline walked back to her desk. She picked up a silver pen, turning it over in her fingers. The CEO was returning, reassembling the armor piece by piece. "Fine," she said, her voice regaining its crisp authority. "You stay where you are, but I'm bumping your salary another 40%, and you are officially the final sign-off on all North American reroutes. I don't want a VP getting in your way." Liam smiled, a real, genuine smile. "I can live with that." He turned to leave. He made it halfway to the door before he stopped. He looked back over his shoulder. "Ms. Hayes," Liam said, "that tea offer, it's still open." Jacqueline paused. She didn't look up from her desk. "I prefer Earl Grey," she said quietly. "Loose leaf. None of that bagged garbage." "I'll pick some up," Liam said. He walked out of the office, the heavy glass doors sliding shut behind him, leaving the billionaire alone in her tower. It was a Saturday in late October, a year and a half after the night the floor manager got fired. The air was crisp, smelling of decaying leaves and wood smoke. Liam was standing in the front yard of a modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs. It wasn't a mansion. It didn't have a gate or a pool. It had a small, fenced-in backyard, a decent school district, and a roof that didn't leak. He was holding a rake, staring at a massive pile of oak leaves he had spent the last 2 hours compiling. Suddenly, the pile exploded. Chloe erupted from the center of the leaves, screaming with laughter, covered in brown and gold debris. She was 8 now. The missing teeth had grown back. The asthma was tightly controlled. She looked healthy. She looked happy. "You ruined my masterpiece, Bug," Liam groaned, leaning on the rake. "It was a trap," she yelled, throwing a handful of leaves at his legs before taking off, running across the lawn. Liam chuckled, shaking his head. He started raking the scattered leaves back into a pile. He heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He turned around. A sleek, black town car was pulling up to the curb. It looked entirely ridiculous in the middle of a middle-class suburban neighborhood, like a shark swimming in a backyard wading pool. The engine cut out. The driver didn't get out. The back door opened. Jacqueline Hayes stepped onto the sidewalk. She wasn't wearing a suit. She wore dark denim jeans, a heavy cream-colored cable-knit sweater, and a pair of practical leather boots. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail. She still looked intimidating. She carried her power like a physical weight, but the edges were softer. She walked up the short driveway. She was holding a small, matte black tin. "You have leaves on your shirt, Liam," she observed dryly, stopping at the edge of the grass. "It's an occupational hazard of homeownership," Liam said, leaning the rake against an oak tree. He walked over, brushing the debris off his flannel shirt. "You found the place?" "My logistics network is quite robust," she replied, a faint smirk playing on her lips. She held up the tin. "Earl Grey, imported from London. It cost more than your rake." "I'll go boil the water," Liam smiled. They sat on the back porch. The wooden deck was worn but sturdy. Chloe was in the yard, trying to teach a neighbor's golden retriever how to sit, with disastrously funny results. Liam set 2 ceramic mugs on the small patio table. He poured the tea from a battered aluminum kettle. The steam rose in the cool autumn air, carrying the sharp bergamot scent of the expensive tea. Jacqueline picked up her mug. She didn't take a sip immediately. She just held it, letting the heat seep into her hands. She watched Chloe running across the grass. There was no romantic tension between them. That was a fantasy for movies. They were 2 fundamentally damaged people, separated by billions of dollars and entirely different worlds, connected by a highly specific, deeply traumatic frequency. They were survivors. "She's getting tall," Jacqueline noted quietly. "Yeah," Liam said, blowing on his tea. "She hit a growth spurt last month. Pants I bought her in August are already too short. It's a logistical nightmare." "I can have my procurement department look into it," Jacqueline offered deadpan. Liam laughed. A short, genuine burst of sound. "I think I can handle the gap, boss." They sat in comfortable silence. The screaming urgency of the corporate world was 30 miles away, locked in a glass tower. Out here, there was just the wind, the leaves, and the quiet hum of survival. "Do you ever stop missing them?" Jacqueline asked suddenly. She didn't look at Liam. She kept her eyes fixed on the yard. Liam knew she wasn't talking about Sarah. She was talking about David. She was talking about the empty space in the room that never quite goes away. Liam took a slow sip of his tea. It was, undeniably, excellent tea. "No," Liam answered honestly. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't offer fake hope. "You never stop missing them. The hole doesn't close up." He set his mug down and looked at Jacqueline. "But you build around it," he said softly. "You build a life that's big enough to hold the hole. You go to work. You buy the expensive tea. You rake the leaves. And eventually the hole just becomes part of the architecture." Jacqueline absorbed the words. She didn't cry. The glass in her eyes didn't shatter. She just nodded slowly, a deep, profound acceptance of the brutal reality they both shared. "Architecture," she murmured, tracing the rim of her mug with a perfectly manicured thumb. "I suppose we both know a little something about building things." "We do," Liam agreed. A loud shriek of joy echoed from the yard as the golden retriever finally sat, demanding a treat. Chloe tackled the dog in a massive hug. Jacqueline Hayes, the ruthless, terrifying billionaire, watched the scene. The tight, defensive lines around her mouth finally relaxed. She took a sip of her tea. "It's a good house, Liam," she said quietly. Liam looked at his daughter, then looked at the woman sitting on his porch, the woman who had walked into his darkest moment smelling of lemon bleach and scrubbed the floor of his ruined life. "Yeah," Liam said, leaning back in his chair. "It's a really good house. We spend our lives grinding for titles, building empires, and convincing ourselves the paycheck will somehow patch the terrifying, quiet holes in our lives. But Liam and Jacqueline's story proves that real power isn't found in a 50-story glass penthouse. It's found in the wreckage. It's showing up when the world falls apart. It's a decent cup of tea. If this story hit a nerve, do me a favor. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone who needs a harsh reality check on what actually matters in this life. Finally, drop a comment below. What is the one thing you would trade an empire to keep?